Hello.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival, Day 10. My name is James Runcie, and I chair quite a lot of events here. Why am I talking about myself, you may think? The thing is that I get to choose, a lot of the time I get to choose who I chair, and some events I think that will be good for me, and that I should do that really. And then some events I think, oh God, I'm just going to have a really nice time and choose a really lovely person who writes lovely, brilliant books. Such a person is Victoria Hislop. Please welcome Victoria Hislop.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, you don't need me to mansplain Victoria's backlist, but her current book is obviously the multi-million selling author of The Return and The Island and Carte Postale, which last time we talked about here 2 years ago. But here we're going to talk about Those Who Are Loved, a truly epic book, a really epic book that kind of goes from now backwards to the 1930s and tells the extraordinary story of Greek contemporary history over 86 years through the eyes of one family. Did you know, when you had this idea, how vast and epic it was going to be?
No, I didn't have any idea that I would write a book that was more than 500 pages. And my apologies to readers for how heavy it is when you're sitting in bed. I wanted to write about a very particular place, and that particular place becomes a central location in the story. But in order to write about that, I had to kind of surround it with the historical facts that came before and after this island of Mykonissos became a prison camp. So I think probably lots of writers, they begin with a nugget and then they have to surround it with, you know, all the things that kind of come before and after. And that the particular place, let me explain, because it's you'll probably read the first few hundred pages and be waiting to find out about it. It's an island that I actually saw for the first time 10 years ago, the island of Mykonissos, which, if anyone in here is Greek, you'll probably have heard of it, but most non-Greeks, it's an absolute mystery to them, this place, because it's an uninhabited, more or less unvisitable island.
Whereabouts?
Well, it's very close to the mainland, which is why it kind of struck me with such force when I saw it the first time. And it's very near Cape Sunion, which is where the Temple of Poseidon is located. And it's one of those beautiful locations that many tourists go to, particularly for the sunset. And it's an absolutely idyllic monument, thousands of years old, a golden temple, one of Greece's great treasures. And I was taken there a decade ago this summer by a friend, and he expected me to just fall in love with this wonderful place. And indeed, it's beautiful. Byron loved it so much he carved his name in it, which I always thought absolutely summed it up. Byron, we love him so much, but he was a vandal and went about destroying all sorts of things, including lots of people's hearts. So I was standing looking at the temple, but then I noticed only about 10 kilometres from the coast, this very sort of dark spit of land, and I asked my Greek companion where this was, you know, what was this island, because I didn't know there were any islands that close to this part of the mainland, which is very near Athens. And he said, oh, very darkly, he said, oh, that's Mykonissos. And he said, you can't go there. And I said, well, why? You know, that immediately makes me want to go somewhere if somebody says that you can't. And he said it was a prison camp, and it's where the communists were sent. And all of these things just immediately put my hairs on end. I mean, that's literally been the starting point for all the books I've written, that I hear about a place that I'm usually looking at or actually standing in, and I feel this amazing sensation of literally my hackles rising. And I said, well, what communists and when and why were they sent there? And he knew nothing. I mean, I actually believe that he didn't know anything because it's quite an untold bit of history even in Greece, or had been up to then. And so I stopped plying him with questions, and for the next 5-6 years read everything I could about Macronissos and tried to get there. And the thing that he'd said that really was true was that it was very hard to visit. And I, on several occasions, hired a boat to take me there, and then on the day, these waters between this bit of mainland and Macronissos are extremely rough and dangerous, so I couldn't go. So all this inability to actually go and visit just made me all the more intrigued. So Macronissos, it's another island.
Because it's the same idea. I mean, Spinalonga in the
In
island.
a strange way.
It's the same kind of
it's
idea. But
same.
inspired by this
Yeah.
mystery place that you don't, with an uncertain or unknown or not such a big public history.
Yes, absolutely. In a place where at one point there were tens of thousands of people living, and now it's abandoned. It's an island without water, there are no trees, it's a very, very inhospitable landscape, which obviously when I finally managed to get there, you know, I saw for myself. So that was the starting point, understanding this role that communism had played in the 20th century history of Greece. But in order to write about that, I wanted to explain to my readers and to myself what had led up to the fact that there had been this huge prison camp so close to the Greek mainland, and what had happened there. So that took me back and back and back.
Well, I suppose the first thing you have to do is put a person, a character, on it. So
Indeed.
how did you decide to put your main character, Themis, in this place?
Well, of course, when I found out that there were communists in a huge prison camp on Macronissos back in the 1940s and into the 50s, in my mind, immediately, and perhaps as a kind of cliche, I just pictured men. And indeed, many of the sort of available photographs online and the films that were made about Macronissos, most of all, it was men who were there. And then I came across one day, in all this research I was doing, pictures of women, and that completely established for me that I would tell the story of Macronissos, because on the whole, of course there are male characters in the story, but on the whole, up to now, my protagonists have always been women. You know, I feel I can write better about women than men. Of course, I was shocked to think that in Greece particularly, where women up to those days had never really played any role in politics, they didn't have the vote, even during this period that I'm writing about. So the fact that I understood that women had been sent and treated very brutally as prisoners on Macronissos, that gave me my protagonist, and I almost immediately, in a sense, knew who she was, that she'd be a very, in some ways, untypical Greek woman, you know, very sort of tough, feisty. She's a woman who has had to use a gun, and she was sort of, as characters, you will know this yourself, James, that sometimes characters literally, they are born. You know, they come, well, they're not born really as babies, but they're born as almost fully formed, you know, human beings, and you don't have to kind of necessarily nurture them in your imagination from the moment of their birth. But Themis literally appeared for me, and I even knew her name from the beginning. I'd met a woman who I admired very much. She's actually an actress in Greece, and she's called Themis. When I met this woman, I thought, you are very much this kind of woman that I want to write about, someone extremely tough and strong and fighting in a war. And then discovered, to my joy, that Themis actually is the goddess of justice. So that, again, just cemented for me who her personality, what her personality would be.
But we don't initially meet her like that. Somebody, another writer, might go, right, I'm going to go bang, straight into the camp, straight into the war. But we meet her right at the beginning, and ask you to read this little section, as a granny. And a granny with a past that everyone thinks that she's very good at the practical things, and cooking. Food becomes a very important thing, but cooking, sewing, she does a lot of granny-like things, as if she doesn't have a past, does she? That is your sleight of hand.
Yeah, well, that's how I think a lot of young people see older people.
Yes.
Because they see you as somebody who isn't as physically, they can't imagine how you were when you were a young person.
Yeah.
And a lot of, certainly teenagers are quite sort of oblivious. And I know I was myself. I mean, I'm usually writing about myself in some way in the stories I create. That teenagers just see the surface. And, it's something I always say to younger people: sit your grandparents down and tell them to tell you everything about their past, because they won't always be there. That's a fact. And I know, so many people in this tent, in this wonderful space, won't have done that because their grandchildren don't appear to be interested. But many people in this place have lived through things that teenagers just have no idea. They just literally see you as somebody doing, I've got slightly a tapestry thing in my own head at the moment. A lot of us, when we get older, we do some tapestry work. It's a thing women do, James. I highly recommend it.
Really marvellous.
Well, it's not, no, I've just been to the Grace and Perry exhibition, which is just the most joyful thing. But, younger people see older people doing kind of slightly sedentary things. They can't picture them as they were as active 20-year-olds. And Themis has these grandchildren, and this is how they rather see her, as the lady that cooks and, looks after them, and has never shared her memories before. And the reason that she hasn't shared them are very political, because, many people in Greece who fought for the left during the period of the 40s, 50s, and then right onwards up and through the 70s, had to hide their politics. So this character of mine, Themis, has very solid reasons for not having told the younger generations her past.
Because the past comes into the present. And what's rather remarkable, one of the most remarkable things about this, the beginning of the book, is this idea that we flash back, obviously, to the 1930s and the rise of fascism. But of course, outside this modern 2016 granny family gathering are contemporary fascists hanging out. You actually have them hanging out black T-shirts on the line. So it's like 80 years difference, and black shirts are still being washed. It's the most extraordinarily powerful image, and you do it quite subtly. I make that sound like quite obvious, but it's done almost as an aside.
Well, it's the reason that I, have this repetition of history is that history does get repeated. So it's not just some clever sort of literary conceit or way of spinning a story. I mean, it's actually an observation. That when I was writing the book, I'm very happy to say now that fascism is kind of receded in Greece, perhaps more than, in the city where I live in London, where you've got a slight sort of rise of the right. In Greece, where they had this extraordinary and fast rise of Chrissy Avier, they've literally lost their seats in Parliament now. But a while back, they had many. So, fascism has came right up and is gradually going away again in Greece. But the sort of 2012 moment that I'm writing about, they were very strong.
Give us a flavour of it, Victoria.
Yes, I'll read a bit that doesn't, because James and I were chatting about how difficult sometimes it is to talk about a book without giving away the story, which I really don't want to do here today. But I'm just going to read the very opening of the book, where Themis, who is celebrating her 90th birthday on the day the book begins, realises that she actually has nothing physical, tangible to leave these grandchildren of hers, but the one thing that she does have is her story. So this is where she takes two of them out to tell them. A few minutes passed. The sun had gone down now, and street lamps were coming on. Themis leant across to touch Poppy's hand. "Why don't we go out for a coffee?" she whispered. "Then we'll go into the little church. There's something I always do on my birthday." "Pray," Poppy said with surprise, knowing that her grandmother was not specially devout. "No, Agapimu, I light some candles." "Didn't you have enough on your cake?" teased Poppy. Themis smiled. "Who are they for?" Nikos asked keenly. "Come with me, and I'll tell you," she said, looking at Nikos, as ever mildly thrown by the strong resemblance to the man after whom he would be named. During the course of that day, with her family crammed into the small apartment, Themis had reflected with some regret that she had nothing to bequeath her children and grandchildren. There was little of any worth except the battered table around which the family had been eating for generations. Or was there perhaps some other kind of legacy? She suddenly realised now that Yorgos was absent in all but body, and that there were things that she would like to tell them. Her life story was not an heirloom, but it was all she had, and she would give it to these two young people. She loved all her grandchildren equally, but had special affection for Poppy, because she had seen her almost every day since she was born. And for Nikos, she had a particular soft spot, even though he visited only once a year. They quickly got ready to leave, Nikos helping his grandmother into her cardigan, while Poppy threw on her faded red thrift shop coat. Nikos would be getting a plane back to the States the following morning, and Themis insisted he have some fresh baklava and proper Greek coffee before he left. They had all eaten copiously at lunchtime, but she could not refuse, and soon they were at the local Zacharoplastion. Once they were seated, Themis began to talk. So what she tells them is the 500 pages. I've always wanted to read my own book on audio, but I actually think 500 pages would probably be a bit of a labour. Juliet Stevenson has done it instead, though, and she's done a very good job, I have to say.
Maybe better. I actually read the beginning again when I'd finished it, because it's sort of, you needed to come back to that beginning to understand that framing device. And what happens, not what happens in the book, but this character is then hurtled back into the 1930s. And this is not a history everyone is familiar with its speed of change, its regime change. So written here, 1936, Metaxas dictatorship, 1940, Italian invasion, 1941, German invasion, puppet regime, Quisling prime minister, security battalions, resistance movements, which is when it all kicks off, Great Greek famine, the White Terror, the Civil War, and this is all before 1948. So you've got this incredibly vicious, violent, terrifying history in which you put this Themis, and she's got three siblings, she's got a sister and two brothers, against this absolute surge in event, an historical event. How do you manage to hold on, how do you manage to balance individual character against this rush of history?
Well, having these four siblings all reacting to these events in very different ways. I suppose I'm living through the events through them. Because, as you just described it wasn't even a roller coaster, this decade of Greek history. It was just a constant, almost seismic shaking of the earth. And I suppose when I go to Greece now, and when I'm sure probably everybody here has had the opportunity to visit at least once, if not more, when you go to Greece now, and usually in a holiday mode, everything seems so peaceful. And I suppose that's what I always want to describe in my books, that things aren't what they seem and weren't what they seem. And so much of this Greek history has never really certainly been taught to British people. I think probably the most, perhaps the educated Brits seem to know about is the fact that Churchill, we were a bit involved at the end of the occupation, and we sent in troops to kind of get involved in this sort of battle that happened in Athens. Lots of people seem to know about that because Churchill was involved. And of course, if Churchill was there, that tends to kind of hit our history books. But in terms of how I sort of relate these events and make them in any way sort of palatable, it's by, in this story, having people who are on both sides of the political divide. Because right even from the beginning in the 30s, when the story begins, there was already this fascist dictatorship in Greece. And that is, for me, such an extraordinary thing, to feel that the Nazi invasion took place in a country that was already essentially in the grip of fascism. And of course, being teenagers at the time, as my characters all are when this happens, they have different views about it. You know, there were many Greeks who were quite comfortable under Metaxas. They felt that this Greek dictator had brought organisation, law and order to their country, because things had been drifting a bit left before that, which is, you know, why he came in and took power. So he had a lot of support. So some of my teenage characters during this late 30s period are very happy to dress up in their what's the equivalent of the Hitler Youth Movement, which was a compulsory organisation in Greece called EPON. So two of these teenage characters absolutely love it. You know, they love putting on the uniform. They love the fact that they have to have the boy has to have his hair cut short, and the girls have to wear, you know, very sort of strict uniform. And then two of the siblings loathe it. They absolutely detest it, you know, just in the way that you're going to get with teenagers in any, whatever decade you were talking about. So as they sort of progress through the decade, as it turns into the 40s, and find that the Nazis have invaded, two of my siblings...
Oh, Andy, we've lost Victoria's... Dave. We've lost...
Have you lost me?
Yeah, we've lost Victoria, which is the key person, really. Dave, could you, have you...
Do you want me to fiddle with
I think we may have a visit. We might have a visit. Otherwise, it's really boring because you don't really want to listen to me.
You could read the 500 pages.
I could read all 500 pages, I suppose. Oh,
I'll have a look, see if it's...
have you turned up? Oh, here we go. Sorry. Oh, we can have a little portable. We'll have this portable. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Is that working?
That's best. Sorry.
Very, very efficient in Edinburgh.
Well,
Not a moment lost.
so, of course, there are four of them, and the elder brother, I think the elder brother, whose name I can't pronounce, Thanasis, and the elder sister, Margarita, both are Nazi sympathizers, really, and she's a sort of, this is early on, so I'm not giving too much away. But I think what's interesting is that Themis has the opportunity before making a decision, because she starts the novel at the age of 5, but when she becomes a teenager, she has the opportunity to watch, she has the opportunity to see how her two brothers and sister play out, and her grandmother's anxiety. What's rather beautiful is she's brought up by a grandmother, and of course it's a grandmother telling the story. So again, this mirroring between past and present. She's brought up by a grandmother, which when we were walking in, you said you didn't realize that was an accident, but it seems to me unbelievably nice and deliberate. But that just came to you, did it? To have a grandmother framing both bits of the story, as it were.
Yes, well, I think, again, I mentioned that lots of things tend to be borderline autobiographical in probably what most people write.
Yeah, but you're not a granny.
You're writing a little bit about the church.
Yes.
That my own grandmother played a very significant role in my childhood. So I always I thought I knew a lot about grandmothers. I knew about one grandmother, i.e. my own. I had two, but one of them lived with us, and I was very close to her. So I think, that just seems very natural to me to have this grandmotherly presence in the house. So when I'm describing her ways and the way she's constantly trying to field arguing children, because whether or not they're arguing about politics or the last bit of bread and who's going to have it in this novel, the way that grandmothers are is very much from my experience, very personal experience, and the fact that the story is then told by a grandmother to her children just seemed to be a sort of natural bookending in this story.
And food might seem like the family meals that are eaten, provided by the grandmother and then the difficulty of providing meals. Food becomes almost a weapon or a symbol of the state of the country. So food, while at the beginning you think she's just putting in a few Greek recipes here, you then realize what's going on, because the food gets thinner, the soups get less and less meat in them, and then we lead to the famine, and then so food becomes everything becomes a sort of social indicator, doesn't it?
Well, it begins with this birthday party when Themis is 90, and the table is still covered with lots of food that hasn't been eaten, and the grandchildren comment on this, because when the story begins in sort of 2016, many people in Athens are going hungry, and still are. There's a great deal of poverty. And so they quiz her on this, and they say, why have you over-catered in this way? This is a terrible waste. And she explains to them that she almost deliberately overfeeds because of the period of famine that she'd gone through as a child. And food, up to a point, it is in Northern Europe, but I think in Greece, food is an obsession among people. It's the first thing anybody does when you go in their house, is that whatever time of day it is, you're sort of stuffed with food, which is lovely. It's their way of displaying, an overflowing hospitality, almost to demonstrate that they can, that now, there is plenty. And feeding these children, obviously, it's a life and death situation in the central part of the book. One of the little-known things about the period of the Nazi occupation that struck me, very strongly, was that Greece had a famine during the 1941 to 42. It took place when more than 100,000 people literally starved to death, many of them in the streets of Athens. And was actually the reason that Oxfam was set up in the first place. The famine was known about by a group of academics in Oxford, and they thought, we have to do something. and got together and started sort of literally rattling tins in the streets of Oxford to try and raise some money to buy supplies. And thereafter, I think that was a very pivotal moment in Greek modern history, the fact that there was this great starvation. I think actually more people died of starvation than were actually killed by the Germans during that period. And yes, the grandmother's constantly foraging for food, the children are sent out, and all of this is not, in a way, so much of what I've written, although my characters are fictional, all the facts are very true in terms of how much Greece suffered, particularly in that decade. And I haven't I haven't exaggerated anything vis-a-vis the physical and kind of psychological suffering of the Greek people during that time. There's certainly no exaggeration with the famine at all, which is why the rest of the book is always punctuated with, in fact, I should put some recipes in the back.
No,
which I'd love to do. Because most of the cooking that I do these days is Greek myself, so I could knock a little recipe book off.
No, but just to be not frivolous, this is a very serious conversation, and normally we have a bit of a chat about things, so we're having an adjustment. What's extraordinary about this is that, I'll just waffle while this happens, but what's extraordinary about this book is, I think, and you can have a think about how to answer this, not a question, it is about, it's not a holiday, it's rather bizarre, it's a best-selling book, but I wouldn't describe it as a holiday read, because it's actually quite tough. A lot of this is not sentimental or romantic. It's quite tough. It's not difficult. It's not hard. You don't dwell on things a lot. You deal with birth and death. There's a lot of birth and a lot of death, but it's very much part of the. You don't have 30-page death scene, but you manage to make it. You have the book has an energy to it. It has a tautness to it, but it's not sentimental and it's not self-indulgent.
Well, that's high praise, and you're making me think about, very often when you're sitting on a stage like this, you have a question will provoke a new idea. Certainly for me, it's something I've never thought about till this moment. But one of the reasons I think this sort of energy of the cycle of birth and death very much comes through, perhaps in this book, is that is very Greek. Their ways of dealing with birth and death are quite pragmatic, in a way that I don't think that certainly the Church of England, perhaps the Church of Scotland, I don't know obviously as much about it, but the way that the C of E, the Protestant Church, deals perhaps with death isn't quite so well structured as the Greek Orthodox Church. What I mean by that is, when somebody dies in Greece, and because I spend a lot of time there, I go to a lot of baptisms and funerals, and you've probably seen it if you've travelled in Greece, that the minute that somebody dies, or perhaps certainly within 12 hours, a sign will go up, and it's posted all over town, and you'll see a photograph of perhaps somebody that you knew, and it'll say exactly when the funeral will be, and that's always within 24 hours. So you see people pausing sometimes there'll be a whole wall, and it'll be pasted with these death notices. And people stop and they review them as though they're deciding, what to go and see at the Fringe tonight. I'm not being sort of too light-hearted. This is what you see people doing. You see, well, if there's a face that you recognise, perhaps, generally it'll be the death of an elderly person, obviously, but you'll note that, and you'll know that the following day you will be there for the funeral at 11. And then the following day after that, and then for 3 days, there will be a service in the church, a memorial. Then there'll be one at 30 days, and usually 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years. So what the punctuation marks are for mourning. And, you know, because I know many people there who've lost loved ones, and I know how they mourn. And when the 3 years happens, you know, we all know that people, especially old ladies, wear black. You know, you see that very ubiquitously. The day that the 3 years is up, they will go back to wearing something more colourful. So it's a very sort of structured grieving, and I sort of celebrate that in a way, because it means that people know that everybody is sharing their grief, they know when the important dates are, and also when it's going to finish. And then you see people almost flowering again, you know, when they've done the 3 years of grief. And the other thing that is very much part of this sort of acceptance of death, in a way that I often don't find among my own friends and relatives in England, is that there's a very rigid way of naming your grandchildren. So if I have grandchildren, the firstborn daughter will be named Victoria, and the firstborn son would be named Ian. This would not even be questioned. And it does lead to confusion, because if I had 3 children and they all had a girl and a boy, they would all be named Victoria and Ian. And I know it's humorous, isn't it? So I know, you know, you'll go to a wedding and there'll be, a friend of mine got married recently, and there were 3 Theodoris Papadoulikises there, who were all about 25, because they were the firstborn grandson. But it's a lovely, for me, this is a wonderful way of seeing this recycling, this regeneration, this renewal of human life. And it's symbolic, but it's also very pragmatic, and it's very real, and I find it very beautiful. So I'm now Greek Orthodox, and my godmother, my nonna, is Margarita. So she has little granddaughters called Margarita, and several of them, and they're all waiting in the wings, and I feel that's rather beautiful. So that when she goes, she'll be remembered day by day, because these little Margaritas will have grown up, and in a flash they'll be grandmothers and they'll have little Margaritas. So that's my observation about why there's a lot of birth and death, because the death isn't feared. Nobody fears death in Greece. They grieve it, they lament it, but it's not, it's all part of the cycle.
And the title of this book, Those Who Are Loved, is an epitaph in many ways, or it's from. Explain to me.
Yes, the title.
The title is rather beautiful.
Well,
but it's from a poem, isn't it?
Themis, who's my heroine, who goes through some pretty major catastrophes and loss and births, deaths in her own life, and fights, and is tortured at various times, and survives it all. But during this progression of her life, she more or less loses her religious faith. She finds it very hard to kind of hold on to the structures of the church, such as they are. But nevertheless, she remembers the dead in a way that I think a lot of people do. I mean, a lot of us, I mean, it's harder. I mean, in the Church of England, we don't light candles, but in Catholic Church and in the Greek Orthodox Church, when you go in to any building, they're usually ablaze with candles. You know, they're all a fire risk, because you've got sort of big ones, little ones, and they just, you know, the flames are almost licking the ceiling. But one of the reasons that Themis always lights candles is to remember the people that she has loved. And when I was writing the book, and it's a, you know, a lot of this, as I say, as James says, it's quite a dark period of Greek history, many losses and hardship for people. And as I was coming towards the end, I thought, well, you know, what's the hope, you know, if this happens just to one country? You know, what's the redemption? What gives people a reason to believe that things will get better? And I came across, none of you will probably be able to see it because it's a little picture, but on the cover of this book, which is a single poem, is a very emblematic Greek. It's a photograph taken in Greece in 1936. And it's pretty faded even for those in the front row. It's a very, you know, it's a snapshot taken, you know, so many years, 80, 90 years ago. And it shows the picture of a woman grieving over the body of her son. And this young man in 1936 had been one of the demonstrators during a strike which the tobacco workers in Thessaloniki staged. You know, there was growing sense in Greece that, you know, people's basic human rights, if they were labourers and farm workers, that they were not being respected, and indeed they weren't. But strikes were illegal, and the police opened fire on this demonstration and killed many of the demonstrators, including this young man who was pictured during the following days in the newspapers. And as a kind of historical fact, it was the reason it gave Metaxas, who you mentioned in your summary, the reason basically to stage a coup, and he said, no more democracy, everything's getting out of hand, we're going to have a dictatorship. So this particular strike and the consequences of it were the reason that in 1936 Greece found itself under Metaxas. Anyway, this photograph was seen by a young poet called Yanis Ritsos, and he, within 36 hours, wrote this very long 22 stanza poem called Epitaphios, which is basically, he'd seen the woman grieving over her son in the newspapers, and he'd been so moved by the image and by the outrageousness of what had happened that he wrote a poem through the voice of the mother. And it's a very political work, it's a very emotional work, as you can imagine, where she celebrates his sacrifice, in a sense, for you know, losing his life, but everyone will now know and everyone will remember this her beloved boy. And at the end, towards the end of the poem, she says, well, you know, you will never die because you'll never be forgotten. And that's what I believe people really are doing, whether or not they're religious, when they light a candle in church. And there was a particular line that resonated very much. And I'm just going to read it because it's a very, and I, as well as, obviously you'll feel free to buy my book, but I would love everyone to go away and read the whole of this absolutely wonderful poem. I'm going to read it in Greek and then in English. It's literally 2 lines. And she calls him, when she's addressing her son, she calls him my little bird, which is a very common way for mothers to address their children in Greece, their beloved sons normally. Poulimu, hilies diozoes se senane methenon, ke osi agapiunde ke nekri, pote tus then pethenon. And in Greek, this book will be called Osi agapiunde, which means those who are loved. So she says, 1,000 lives and more, my little bird, bind me to you, and those who are loved never die, not even in their death.
Thank you. And that's why it's called Those Who Are Loved.
Indeed, and I think everybody knows that sense that when they, you know, light a candle. And I wish, in Protestant church we did more of it.
We do sometimes.
Do you?
Yeah, sometimes.
Do you?
Yeah.
But in Greek churches, you always, you can just go in and light candles and leave, and it's always a way of sort of resurrecting somebody,
Yes.
and that's what she's hoping to do. And indeed, the kind of wonderful layer of this is that Yanis Ritsos, by writing this poem, immortalized, this young man. So Themis, when she, at the beginning I mentioned in her narrative, she takes these young grandchildren to church, as she does every year on her birthday, to kind of resurrect the memories. And indeed, by telling the stories of the people, which the 500 pages tell you, you sort of bring back the deeds that they have done. And, she doesn't remember everyone she's ever known. She only remembers really the ones that she's loved. And there's a particular character in the book who's the villain, if anything, and she doesn't light him a candle. So, we all know we light candles for those that we love.
Thank you. Questions? Can we have some lights, please? Thank you so much. I thought we'd have a bit of banter, but of course it's a very serious book. But I thought we'd have, normally we do joshing, but we haven't done any joshing. So
we can do some joshing now.
Any questions, joshing or seriousness? Anything about Greece or previous work? Yes, lady there. Thank you very much. And then.
Hi, I've loved all your books and I've learnt quite a lot through them, but they're all in the 50s, 40s, 50s. Greece has still struggled more than other European countries more recently, and wondered if you think about doing one in more recent times.
Very good question. I mean, the period this book covers more or less from the 30s right up, or sort of up to the present, but historically it finishes in 1989. So there is a sort of taste of that, although 89 sounds so long ago, doesn't it? Last millennium. I would like to write a book about more contemporary Greece, and until recently I never felt that I could do that, because nothing really seemed to be resolved. Every time there was a catastrophe, you think, well, what's going to be the outcome? What's going to be the happy end? Because I can't write a story unless there is. The 89 moment, which I won't tell you what happened, but it was a moment of great catharsis in Greek history. But then, of course, since then, new and difficult things have happened in the country. But right now, there's a sort of, not a happy end necessarily, but there's a real feeling of regeneration and rebirth and optimism in Greece. 5 years ago, when I was going there and they had the credit controls and there were frightening queues outside the banks for people to get their money out because they were restricted very, very much, almost overnight without any warning, and it was a sense of crisis. And at that point, whenever I went there, people were very low in mood. And now when I go there, people say to me, gosh, what's it like in England? Now, I know, it's funny, but it's also, I'm on the receiving end of their sympathy and concern, and quite rightly. I'm feeling pretty sorry for all of us at the moment. I'm sure most of you feel as I do. But whereas in Greece, they've had an election, they're coming up to 1821 was what they call the Greek Revolution, when they got rid of their occupiers, the Turkish, the Ottoman yoke, as they think of it. So in 2021, there will be great celebrations for the 200 years since their sort of big occupation period. So altogether in Greece, there is this wonderful sort of moving towards a kind of new peak, and that's really something to celebrate. So that might provoke me to write a story with a really happy end. So yes, never say never. And the period of the junta, the 67 to 74 period, when they had this very savage, I think, military dictatorship under a group of, thoroughly horrific and cruel, the colonels, is a period that I refer to in this book. It's a few chapters, but I would love to write, if that would be modern enough for you, I'd like to write a story that's set in that 67 to 74 period, because that is, that's very much within my own memory. So yes, I haven't stopped writing about Greece, for sure.
There was somebody, yes, just here, thank you. Is there anybody over? Yeah, thank you, and then I'll come to you next.
You obviously have a lot of knowledge and a lot of love for Greece, and I just wondered what was behind that, what your connection was with Greece to be able to write that and to have that come out in your books.
Well, thank you for the question. It is a love, and it doesn't come from any family roots, no background. I went there for the first time when I was a teenager, and have loved it ever since. But of course, with love, real love, not just that first kind of adolescent passion that I probably had, and I mean passion for the country. I wasn't having a fling with the local Giovanni, son of the boatman, nothing like that. It was literally a love of the place itself.
Still time.
Not time to be an adolescent, unfortunately. With a very long-lasting love comes, more knowledge and being made to love things that I don't like as well as things that I do. So this sort of love affair with Greece has led to now, more than 40, maybe nearly 50 years of visiting continually. I have a house in Crete, a place in Athens. I speak the language. I've become Greek Orthodox. So I'm sort of digging myself deeper and deeper into the sort of substructure of Greece. And, in that process, I've come to know a lot about it, and to dislike some of it as well as to like it. But the whole sum total of it is a sort of a love and a knowledge and a sense of belonging in a way that isn't actually a rational thing at all. It's completely based down here, but it just becomes a bigger and bigger part of my life. The only thing I don't yet have is Greek citizenship. I would love to have my passport, because I'm not particularly happy with what's going on, and I would like a European. So if anybody who works at the embassy is in here, no, probably not. But that's the next thing that I'm very keen to get. So it doesn't come from any blood connection. It just comes from a real love, a feeling of, if there is such a thing as past lives. I was definitely, I don't know what I was. Probably I was a fisherman's son or something in an island. I don't know. But every time I go there, I feel a sense of coming home. So that's my connection. It's almost a vague one. There are probably more people in here with real, Greek connections than me, anyway.
Gentleman here.
We've loved all your books. We went to Athens on our honeymoon, and in January, and never forget going up to Delphi in the snow with oranges on the tree.
Amazing.
But you did mention Audible books, which my wife and I now almost read books exclusively audibly, because she's got disabilities and problems with hearing and the rest of it. And you're very dependent on the character, the person reading it. You do get a taster before them, and I think it's a great way. We listen to them at night. That's how we get from London to Edinburgh all the time on audio.
That's nice to hear.
And you do get a different spin on it. It's, do you get any choice in who's reading it. The other person who, apart from Juliet Stevenson, John le Carre reading his own book is...
Gosh,
amazing.
yes, so that's... I think I would quite like to do it, but I think I gave her some, not face-to-face, but I gave her some coaching in all the Greek words, because there are quite a few little Greek expressions in this book, and she's done a masterful job. And I think it's easier to imagine doing it than actually. Have you actually read any of yours completely? No. I think it is quite a mammoth task, so I think I am in the future going to leave it to the actresses. We usually get a short list of people who, have agreed that they'd be, open to doing it, and then you pick the one that you'd like most. So we have a little bit of a share in the decision as writers. But Juliet Stevenson has done a really great... You'll perhaps be able to write to me and tell me what you think. But it's interesting with Audible, because actually it's a more shared experience, isn't it? I mean, if you buy one copy of a book, you're either looking over someone's shoulder or snatching it out of their hands or having to wait. But Audible is a very sociable way of appreciating a book. So it's a very big growing thing, so I'm glad that you enjoy it.
Have you got somebody up there? No, yes, at the back there, and then I'll come here, and then we must stop. Sorry, up there, and then there's somebody in here.
Thank you, Victoria.
Where are we? Can you just... Oh, there you are. Sorry, thank you.
We mentioned holiday reads, and I wondered what books you might choose for your ideal holiday read.
Goodness, that is a good question. I mean,
Just say the Grantchester Mysteries.
The Grantchester Mysteries. God.
No, sorry, go on.
So I usually... Oh, it's a fly. That's a sign. It's a fly from... It's a fly from David Nichols, who's here in 24 hours' time. And my holiday reading this year was Sweet Sorrow, which I have to say is, apart from the Grantchester books, is a deeply wonderful, fantastic book. And my problem with a book that I enjoy, even whether it's got 200 pages or 500 pages, is that I cannot physically put it down. So it's a problem. So I sat up 24 hours through the night to read. I thought it would last my whole holiday. I mean, it's got more than 500 pages, and it lasted me a day, so I was a little bit stuck. And then I started reading James.
No, you've already read all of those. Actually, I'm really sorry, but we have run out of time. I'm so sorry. But Victoria will be signing round the corner, the far door of the cafe. I'd like to thank the lovely woman doing the captions.
That's extraordinary. I didn't know that was going on. Well done.
And I'd like to thank you all for coming. Victoria, as I said, is signing just next door to the left, the far door. But please thank Victoria Hislop.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Brilliant.